Hi. This is going to be a controversial video, I think, probably even by my standards. And the reason I say that is that a while ago, a well-known Jewish magazine had come across the following clip of me from an interview with Peter Boghossian.
Obviously, if a person is born in Syria and he happens to be gay, that's very tragic for him.
Oh.
Yeah, I mean, I would not want to be that person. He has all my personal sympathy, but it is not the responsibility of the West or of anyone to take in that person. It's not. And this is why we have to get rid of this kind of universalist ethos, which is also Christian, by the way. So I'll give you another example. I was speaking to a friend who was talking to me about Gaza and agreed with the Israeli position, but said, what are we to do about the innocent children in Gaza who did not choose this? And I said that the we in your statement, already there you've lost me, because this we in your statement, what are we to do, assumes a Western universalistic egalitarian ethos that we have to get rid of. This we does not exist. It certainly doesn't exist to them. It doesn't exist to the people you want to help. And I think this is important for us as philosophers to do as well, to not accept every premise of every conversation that is being had about these issues. We have to take a step further back and say, well, why are we accepting the premise of the we? Why are we even assuming that this is a concern of ours? Again, it doesn't mean that I'm callous, that I have to be callous and that I can't have sympathy for this gay person in Syria. And I know my sympathy isn't going to help him. I'm not, of course, I'm not naive about it. Obviously, he doesn't care about my sympathy because it doesn't do anything for him. But again, it's not our problem. I completely reject this universalist we that so many of the West are infected by.
Boghossian and I have spoken many times by now, and this was from our last conversation, which took place last September here in New York City. So, the magazine was intrigued by my comments and asked me to write them an article in which I would flesh out this subject philosophically. But when I did so, and then sent it to them, they declined to publish the article. And it seems to me that they thereby also confirmed one of the points I made in the article, namely about Christianized Jews. I will present you with the text here, and you can judge for yourself. For those who claim to be interested in philosophical and cultural subjects, and perhaps even in making a name for themselves in that arena, it is extremely important to question the premises of any discussion that a passionate interlocutor would offer. To refer to the clip I showed just now in the beginning, I do not accept the premise of a universal we, because this word here assumes, as I said, a Western universalistic egalitarian ethos, which in turn relies on a number of philosophical principles that I reject. The ultimate result is that while, pointlessly enough, we might have some sympathy for those innocent children in Gaza, it is not the responsibility of the West to help them. This is not, of course, a question of selfishness or of refusing to be of service to others when possible, but rather it's a question of how we relate to the rest of the world and why we relate as we do. Is the world constituted only by us, or by us and them? If the latter is true, then when are we no longer we? Where do they begin? And how much of ourselves does altruism require us to sacrifice? So one would do well to ask what moral principles form the basis of the desire to help the children of Gaza. One should inquire, for example, why is this question of what we are to do about those innocent children even being asked? Why does someone even feel this type of responsibility? Perhaps the answer would be because of a basic humanitarianism. Okay, very well. Then one must inquire, why does someone feel this basic humanitarianism? Is it because he thinks that every human life is sacred? Okay, then where does that feeling come from, or that thought? It is not an automatic or necessarily natural feeling, contrary to what Kant thought in his Critique of Practical Reason and many other passages. Rather, it's something that must be inculcated. Or if this feeling of sympathy is natural, then it is also true that the joy in others' suffering and in inflicting pain is also natural. Someone else might answer that the thought of innocent suffering simply makes him uncomfortable or induces a feeling of moral disturbance. But again, why? These are some of the complex issues that often hide behind seemingly innocuous statements, and they constitute the nexus of questions by which we ought to reject the we, the universalistic egalitarian ethos, in my friend's question. There are, of course, more political reasons for not accepting this we outside of philosophy. For example, as I mentioned in the clip, the universalistic we does not exist to those we would be helping, and it would therefore be counterproductive to have it exist for us. And introducing a large number of Islamic refugees and migrants into Western countries is a disastrous policy, as anyone familiar with Western and Northern Europe's cities could attest. But these are topics that I have already dealt with in some detail elsewhere, and I would here like to focus on the philosophical issue of the universalistic we. There are, of course, many we's that are not only acceptable, but even desirable and necessary, such as the we of family, nation, and religion. Some we's are not necessary, but relatively harmless, such as the we of the local sports team or college fraternity. But the universalistic we is an entirely different matter. Put briefly, the universalistic we, when uttered by a Westerner, has its home in a Christian worldview, but it has some precursors. Middle Platonism helped Christians justify their views to pagans, but especially inspiring was the early Stoic understanding from the Hellenistic era of the Greek concept of logos, espoused above all by Chrysippus, the third Stoic scholar or leader of the Stoic school. And he espoused this logos as a divine universal reason permeating the cosmos in pantheistic fashion, and importantly also permeating human beings. Chrysippus and the Stoics believed that logos existed in different degrees in different human beings. Some humans are more reasonable than others, but importantly, we are all imbued with reason. And since reason is divine, there is at least a spark of the divine in all of us. This philosophy influenced the early Christians, such as through the Gospel of John, in particular 1:14, where the word, logos, is made flesh, typically referred to as the most Greek of all the Gospels, which identifies Jesus with the logos. John had his own particular purposes for the logos, but his view of it arose in an environment where earlier Greek understandings of the logos were influential. Various Christian philosophers then adapted this teaching in the following century, the 2nd century AD, such as Justin Martyr in his Second Apology, and also Clement of Alexandria in his Paidagogos. Justin introduced the idea of spermatic logos, by which God had sown the divine seeds of logos universally throughout the world, both spatially and temporally. Clement, for his part, made more explicit Jesus' role in John as active logos in the world by making him, or it, a potential part of every human being, since we might all one day accept Jesus as our Savior, the Father of us all. And that includes, of course, children in Gaza. So it should be clear that within this approach, a universalistic we begins to make sense. This is not to say, of course, that a Christian must blindly rush to anyone's aid without other considerations being involved. In American public discourse in recent years, there have been increasing mentions of the concept of ordo amoris, the order of love, which originates with Augustine on Christian Doctrine 1:1829 and City of God 15:22, and further developed by Aquinas in Summa Theologica 22q26. It dictates that love is to be directed toward family and local community before it is expanded unto all of humanity. Although this idea too, incidentally, borrows from an earlier Stoic concept, namely oikeiosis, which means familiarizing or homifying, which was developed by Zeno of Citium, the first Stoic scholar, and then also by Chrysippus and the Stoic Hierocles. But it is at least the case that the early Christian worldview made possible the universalistic we that dominates modern left-wing and even politically moderate discourse in the West today, and that is alien to the earlier pre-Hellenistic pagan view. And incidentally, I've tried, but I cannot resist the temptation of pointing out that the Stoics I've mentioned, and in particular Chrysippus, were greater thinkers than the gentlemen usually associated with that school of thought by non-specialists today, namely Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius. But because the former's work, Chrysippus' work, is in a fragmentary state, and because it is more intellectually complex, he and his contemporary colleagues do not receive the credit they deserve, whereas the latter three, Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, and Epictetus, with their easily digestible bite-sized Christmas card wisdoms, are lauded by all and sundry, a great injustice in the history of philosophy. The ethos of this universalistic we, by which so many are affected, is something the West must abandon. It is not the responsibility of our civilization to, Christ-like, be the savior of the world and all its suffering innocents, and who sometimes are in fact not so innocent. The matter is rendered more difficult by the fact that this Christian tendency was boosted in modern times by the French Enlightenment with its anxious hand-wringing about the world's poor and its belief that the nations of the world are basically morally the same. You can see, for example, Voltaire's and Condorcet's notes on Pascal's Pensée and Book 4 of Rousseau's Émile. But a greater knowledge of the world's peoples than those so-called philosophes possessed shows us clearly that there is in fact a point where the we ends and the they begins, that there are irreconcilable ethical differences among nations that must be accepted for what they are. In rejecting this ethos, there are in fact other traditions still within the ambit of the West to which we may appeal. I mention not only the obvious one of the West's pagan origins in Greece before the philosophical tendencies of the Hellenistic era, some of which I've just mentioned, but another one of our civilization's pillars, namely the Jewish one. Since we often have good reason to speak of a Judeo-Christian West, the philosophical differences between Judaism and Christianity are sometimes forgotten. One comes across Christianized Jews all the time who still believe they are philosophically Jewish, not Christian. But here we do in fact have an important distinction, and I'm now going to come to the point that I mentioned in the beginning about Christianized Jews. I will not, however, waste any time here on the growing horde of rabble-rousers on the right who, on X and elsewhere, keep separating off Judaism from Christianity, since their comments are rooted only in anti-Semitism, ignorance, and a failure to understand that Judaism is a sine qua non of the West. Some Christianized Jews like to emphasize the Jewish notion of tikkun olam, repairing the world, and to equate it with what we today would call social justice, that is, the ignorant and vain, in both senses of the word, interference in the business of others, no matter how different or far-flung those other people may be. But it is really, tikkun olam that is, about virtuous action, which when performed collectively by the members of a community, makes their society function better. Now, to be sure, Judaism, unlike classical Greek paganism, considers human life to be sacred. We are all created in the image of God, Genesis 1:26-27 and 9:6, and we should love our neighbors as ourselves, Leviticus 19:18. But it tends to be much more exclusive in its worldview than Christianity, and certainly than the vulgarized Christianity we have today, the one that has passed through the filter of the French Enlightenment and the process of self-secularization in the 19th century. In part since, unlike Christians and Muslims, Jews believe that the Gentiles can also reach salvation simply by being righteous, which is in Talmud Tractate Sanhedrin 105a. Jews have no proselytizing urge, which also means, by the way, that in spite of its exclusivity, Judaism is in a crucial way more tolerant than Christianity and, a fortiori, Islam. And when in another Talmudic passage, Bava Metzia 71a, it is stated that the poor of one's own city come first, this is indeed a recipe for, and in a context of, Jews helping Jews before Gentiles. As I pointed out elsewhere, proselytism assumes that other people, no matter how different, can become more similar to oneself, which is why on this view, Jesus is potentially the father of us all. whereas the Jewish attitude, with its complete lack of proselytism, is that not everyone thinks or can be made to think as we do. This is also why the Jewish way of war is, at least philosophically, more radical than the Christian. There is reason behind the expression, after all, of going Old Testament on someone. Even though historically the opposite was often the case, Jews have traditionally understood that sometimes a problem can be solved only through the utter defeat of the enemy rather than by the enemy's conversion. Utter defeat of the enemy becomes much more difficult or even undesirable if one believes that the we never ends, but that it extends throughout the whole world. The fact that Judaism in many corners, including in fact Israel, is often Christianized can be seen in the war that I mentioned in the beginning of this video. This will be an unpopular view, but Israel itself also suffers too much from the universalistic we, sacrificing hundreds of its own citizen soldiers in order to spare Palestinian lives. Israel went door to door in Gaza, issued early warnings and so on, in order to save their enemy, to kill as few Palestinians as possible. That is one manifestation of the danger and foolhardiness of the universalistic we, and is not, or at least shouldn't be, the Jewish way of war. An even more unpopular opinion, as a side note, will be that even though the return of the remaining few living hostages was of course a cause for rejoicing, their recovery turned into such a cause célèbre, into such a golden calf, that everything else fell by the wayside, the lives of Israeli soldiers being considered a low enough price to pay for the hostages, for Israel's international reputation, and for Israel's sensibility of the universalistic we. In America, such a sacrifice of soldiers for American hostages in a ratio of 5-1 or more would make some sense, since we have a professional army whose members voluntarily sign up knowing that they may have to make the ultimate sacrifice for their countrymen, which of course is why they are so heroic and worthy of our admiration and gratitude. But for a country with a citizen army, such as Israel, I find it obscene that so many fathers, sons, and brothers had to die in order to save the hostages and to preserve the universalistic we. The importance of this rejection of the universalistic we becomes especially striking when one realizes, again, how fundamentally different other civilizations are from ours, and the extent to which these themselves do not accept that we. With a few exceptions, perhaps, such as constituted by, for example, Taoism. But it is safe to say that Taoists are not the ones who are shooting at synagogues or making European streets unsafe. It is not the case, of course, that we should stoop to the level of the barbarians, but there is an ocean of space and room for maneuver between them and us. It is suicidal not to meet force with greater force. It is foolish, and, it must be said, unmanly, not to consider your own family immeasurably more important than a family in an alien civilization. This is not a callous attitude. One can certainly have sympathy for faraway innocents, but it is a matter of living in accordance with the world as it is, a matter of limiting morality to a sphere in which one can actually help others, truly help them, asking not what is universally right, but rather asking what it is right to do here and now. It is a matter of relating to the world in a realistic way. So-called humanitarian activity does have its place. I've engaged in some of it myself, and I'm certainly not a political isolationist, also for America's own sake, but it must take place, such humanitarian activity, only in limited and targeted ways, and with a clear benefit to damage calculation. Crucially, it must strongly prioritize its own civilization. And while Christianity started in a very pacifist way, modeling itself on the Sermon on the Mount, which is just about the only thing from Christianity that many Christians today remember, there were, of course, a number of gentlemen among the church fathers who were more sophisticated thinkers than Jesus himself, and who understood that force is sometimes necessary, even if they were not able to completely abandon the universalistic we. Some of those gentlemen were Lactantius in his late work, Ambrose, and Augustine. Much later, Thomas Aquinas also joined them in this regard. The squeamishness many Western conservatives feel about abandoning the universalistic we never fails to impress. They're incapable of retracing the borders of the we even around the broader Western civilization, not to mention their own countries. A recent example was when a group of Swedish conservatives proudly lauded one of their own for daring to state that anti-Swedish racism should matter as much to Swedish people as other forms of racism. And I shook my head and said, "You people, you still do not understand. Anti-Swedish racism should matter even more to you than other forms of racism because you are Swedish. This is not to say that other forms of racism are a matter of indifference or that they should not be condemned for their turpitude and intellectual laziness. But again, it's a matter of properly relating to the world as it is, of understanding that one's duty is to one's own family, to one's own nation, and that if one does not fulfill this duty, one may not call oneself a man. And it must be understood that this duty of a man to his own family and to his own nation is in a great many cases antithetical to a sense of duty toward humanity at large. Indeed, one should ask oneself, what is the first duty of a man? He has many, but the first duty is to protect the woman in his life, be it his wife, daughter, mother, or sister. And when it is the case, as it is in Europe and slowly beginning to be in the United States, that Islamic and other non-Western immigrants are making life unsafe for women, then it is the duty of men to expel those who cause such unsafety. Any man who would allow the streets of his city to become unsafe for his wife or mother because of a stubborn insistence on a decayed form of liberalism, because of an insistence on a universalistic we that wishes to be of service to all, is not a man. As we survey the philosophical geopolitical situation in which Western countries find themselves, we ought to understand that there are, fortunately, several native Western sources, even pillars, from which we can draw and on which we can stand in our rejection of the universalistic we. We also remember that this we was not paramount to those who laid the foundations of our societies, to those who built them up, that in fact too strong an insistence on such a we would have been counterproductive to their efforts. And so we ought not to be ungrateful to those who created what we have by dissolving the fruits of their efforts in an act of civilizational self-denial and decadence, by incorporating the whole world into our identity, by believing that any human being, simply by dint of being born, must receive our attention and care. This universalistic we epitomizes ingratitude for the efforts of many of those who came before us, and in whose luxurious embrace we rest. In her speech at Tel Aviv's Hostage Square on October 11th, Ivanka Trump said that the return of each hostage was a triumph of, among other things, our shared humanity. No, that is utter nonsense. It was a triumph of, for all its self-imposed limitations, Israeli and American power. One might say that I am being unduly harsh against what is really just a silly political bromide, but that bromide is indicative of a broader attitude that civilized nations, for the sake of their own defense, must learn to shake off. Much better, in the political context, was the recent speech of Secretary of State Marco Rubio in Munich. He emphasized American power rather than humanitarianism and international organizations as the force that brings positive results. And crucially, he emphasized the unity of Western civilization. The sooner we realize these things, the better for all of us here in the West. For us, yes, a narrower we would be wise to concretize.